Hey everyone, welcome back to another evening at Gŵyl. Tonight, I am very, very excited to be talking about Italo Calvino. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
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 So I have with me, obviously, the wonderful Amy O'Donnell, who is bartender and huge Italo Calvino fan. And so I brought her on board to add a little bit of depth. I have read the complete Cosmo Comics, and I've also read the 6 memos for the new millennium. But the book we're actually going to be talking about tonight is If on a Winter's Night, a Traveller.
It is.
It is. So why did you pick this book? And can you give us a little bit of context of what it's about?
Well, I did an Italian degree, and as part of that, I did a lot of Italian literature. The lighting is going crazy. A lot of Italian literature modules, and I studied this book for I think I did an essay on it, and I hated it. I hated writing about it. I hated reading it. But since finishing that module and sort of reading more Italo Calvino, I can appreciate the book, even though I didn't enjoy it at the time. And I feel like if I was to read it for the first time again, without having to study it and without having to write an essay about it and without having to analyse everything in it, I think I would enjoy it a lot more. Basically, it is a postmodern text. It's also a hyper novel. It's a lot of things. The book
Could
is
you
split.
explain a little bit about what both of those terms mean?
I will try if I can remember. So it's split into how many chapters? There are 12 numbered chapters and 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 unnumbered chapters, which I'll expand on a bit more in a second. And each of these chapters tell a different story, basically. So it's a book that has many different stories within it. The numbered chapters themselves tell their own story within it, and it focuses on you, the reader, as in you, the person reading the book. And this is kind of where the postmodern element comes in, because it is kind of talking about the multiplicity of readers. That's something I learned. So the first line of the entire book is, "You are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night, the Traveller. Relax, concentrate, dispel every other thought." So it starts off putting you, the reader, at the centre of the book, as if you are the main character in the book. And as you go through the book, jumping through the numbered chapters, that story takes place, and it is about it. It's very hard to explain in a way that's easy to understand, because it is just it's ridiculous. The story of you, the reader, that you follow through the numbered chapters sort of links in to the separate stories that are told in the chapters that have proper titles. But yeah, the numbered chapter, even I'm still getting confused about it. The numbered chapters talk about different readers trying to figure out kind of a conspiracy about a series of books that have been written, published, and like put on the shelves, but that all have they're not finished. Like, you get halfway through a book and then it cuts out after the first chapter and it just repeats and repeats, and that's the general plot of those numbered chapters. To confuse things even more, the other chapters they all act as the first chapters of various different books. So they're all written in a different style, including like there's like an Eastern, a different style, and all with different themes. So there's one that's set in Japan. There's one that's set in what you assume is a sort of Eastern European, very industrial area. and they all have a different theme, a different style. You get a different feeling from all of them. And the way I took it was that these first chapters that are all different represent the books in the numbered chapters that people read and then find that they're not finished, and they only have the first chapter that just gets repeated. So that's the book.
I feel like I went on a journey.
In a nutshell.
I feel like I went on a journey from when you were first talking, like, what, to sort of coming out the other side. Like,
you kind of start talking about it, and it's not linear. It's not a linear book. You can't explain the book in a linear way. You start talking, and then you think, oh boy, there's that happens. This kind of links into this. All of this, like, it's mad.
Does it feel like short stories? Does it really?
Yeah, because the unnumbered chapters are essentially short stories in themselves. Like, they don't link into each other. They're all different, and they are essentially different short stories. They don't have like a beginning, middle, and end to them. It is like it's setting the scene for that particular story that it's about to tell, but then it stops.
Do you know what I mean? I certainly do. Do you have favourites? Like, are there certain images or anything that like stuck with you?
I really liked. Hang on, where is it? I really liked the one that's set in Japan. If I can find it, hang on. I just really liked the imagery. The title of this particular chapter is on the carpet of leaves illuminated by the moon, which is just
he is a fantastic writer, isn't he? Like, beyond.
I've enjoyed everything I've read, in Italian and in English, and with sort of translated fiction, obviously, because I can speak Italian and I try and read in Italian as much as I can, and sometimes I prefer to read in Italian rather than read an English translation, because I feel like you don't lose. There's a lot of discussion around it. You don't lose any of the sort of. You don't lose the original feel of the book, but sometimes when it's translated, it's obviously not the same, and a lot of it is left up to the discretion of the translator, how they want to translate something, what feeling they want to give a specific phrase, because when you're translating something, you can have one sentence and make it mean about 5 different things. It just depends on the way you translate it. But with Calvino, I would read it in, because of how popular he is and kind of how high he's held. People don't tend to mess with the translations. Like, there's a few faithful translators that do Calvino's work, and a lot of it's by the same guy, and so I don't mind reading it in English. I feel like I still get the same feeling for it. That being said, there are some books that I've written I wish that I've read
for the future.
Some books that I've read in Italian, like the first one that I studied for this particular module, I've read that completely in Italian. I don't think I'd want to read it in English as well, because I wouldn't want to risk. I really like that book, and I really like the feeling that it gives me, and I like the way the language is. So I don't think I'd want to read it in English and get a different perspective, as bad as that sounds.
No, that is fascinating. There are so many different like parts to what you just said that like I want to just sort of pick up on. One that like definitely sort of there are different philosophies of translation, and sort of what philosophy do you, so there's sort of equivalence is the sort of traditional school of philosophy, school of translation, and then you have a more sort of purpose driven and sort of what are you trying to say schools of translation. So I wanted to come back to that, and I also wanted to come back to this idea that I've heard before of people saying that you want one, if a translator and author pairing works, it really works. And I was wondering if that's kind of what you were getting at, like that's how it's interesting that Italo Calvino, by sort of his own fame on his own, has created a good situation for him to be translated in.
Yeah, because I feel like you could be really good at translation, but if you don't like the thing that you're trying to translate, if you don't get if you're translating a book, if you don't get the book and it doesn't like resonate with you, I feel like it would be hard to do a really good job, because it's almost like it's almost like you're rewriting it. You've got to stay faithful to the original text, but you are to a degree free to put your own feelings into it. So I feel like if you didn't have a connection with the book that you were translating, then I feel like that would come across in the translation somehow.
No, I'm sure it does. There's many books. There are many books where sometimes you feel that something's off and you don't know if it was the translation or if that was there in the original, and that's sort of the one of the sort of sticking points to think about, isn't it? But, yeah, absolutely. So what tell me a little bit more about any of the stories in there. Is there anything about this particular book that you'd like to pull out?
Let me think. It's been a while since I read this book. There is another. It's almost like an Easter egg that he's put in there. So the title of the book is "If on a Winter's Night, a Traveller," and all the titled chapters themselves. I didn't notice this until it was pointed out to me. But when you look at it, it's actually it's blatantly obvious. When you look at the contents page, which I've written on, the title chapters themselves spell out essentially the first line of a new book. So they say, if on a winter's night a traveller, outside the town of Malbork, leaning from the steep slope, without fear of wind or vertigo, looks down in the gathering shadow, in a network of lines that enlace, in a network of lines that intersect, on the carpet of leaves illuminated by the moon, around an empty grave, what story down there awaits its end? So there's another story in there somehow. A lot of what Calvino was trying to get at with this is, so I mentioned earlier the multiplicity of readers, and a lot of what we studied when we were talking about this book at uni was the different ways you can read a book. So you can read a book for pleasure, you can read a book to learn, and all of that is kind of touched upon in this book, because there's so many it's all about readers and the act of reading. And there's actually a passage in I think it's chapter 11, so the story of you, the reader, where you end up meeting with a group of other people who have found themselves in the same situation, like reading a lot of different books and not being able to finish them, and they all talk about their different experiences of reading. So I'll just find that, because that is it's also it being a postmodern work of fiction, which is just the style that it's written in. So Calvino, when he first started writing, was a neo-realist writer, so he focused a lot on it was like a new, as the name would suggest, a new style of realism, and a lot of what he wrote about was focused on the resistance and at the end of the Second World War in Italy, and then that was in like the late 40s when he wrote about that, and then as his career progressed, he started writing the Cosmocomics that you mentioned at the start. That's like the first sort of hint of his foray into postmodernism, if you will.
I'm sure I'm dragging this out of my brain somewhere, that he essentially grew frustrated with his sort of neo-realism, didn't he? He didn't think it was essentially getting at the heart of life enough, that it wasn't real enough, and that this postmodern just captured it. And I think he's right. Like, I think that these are works of genius. Like,
yeah, they really are. That's like part of why I've always read from I used to read the dictionary to myself when I was about 5 as a bedtime story, so I've always liked reading. But a lot of what I read is I read history books, because the other half of my degree was a history degree. I very, very rarely read fiction. I can't remember the last work of fiction that I read that wasn't by Calvino, which is ridiculous. So that's basically all I read, and it is I didn't think I'd find a writer that resonated with me in like the way that Calvino does. I just think he's a genius, or was a genius. He's dead.
R.I.P.
So for me personally, for me to find a writer whose every book I'm interested in and every book I love, and I just think the way he writes is so clever. The thoughts he's had are so clever. He writes a lot of prefaces to his books, and those are studied almost as much as his actual texts are. Like, I did one of my essays that I wrote for this particular module was just based on, I think it was like a 5-page preface he did to one of his books, because he put so much analysis in there and there's so much content in them. It's like reading a work of non-fiction, which appeals to me. But yeah, so this chapter 11, where you, the reader, finds a group of other people that are discussing reading, is just it's very meta, I think, because it really makes you think.
You're gonna read it for us, please?
If you want.
Yeah.
I won't read it all because it is pages. There's like 3 pages, but so the first reader addresses you, and says, "Don't be amazed if you see my eyes always wandering. In fact, this is my way of reading, and it is only in this way that reading proves fruitful for me. If a book truly interests me, I cannot follow it for more than a few lines before my mind, having seized on a thought that the text suggests to it, or a feeling, or a question, or an image, goes off on a tangent and springs from thought to thought, from image to image, in an itinerary of reasonings and fantasies that I feel the need to pursue to the end, moving away from the book until I have lost sight of it." Which I can also relate to, because sometimes I'll be reading something and there'll be a line and I'll be staring at the page still, but my mind will be elsewhere, and I'll just be thinking anything that sentence has triggered, and I'll zone back in, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I was in the middle of a paragraph.
Definitely true of the more philosophical books as well.
Yeah. And then in response to that, another reader describes reading as a discontinuous and fragmentary operation, or rather the object of reading is a punctiform and pulviscular material. In the spreading expanse of the writing, the reader's attention isolates some minimal segments, juxtapositions of words, metaphors, syntactic nexuses, logical passages, lexical peculiarities that prove to possess an extremely concentrated density of meaning. Which at first read, that really means a lot of nothing. That's a lot of words, but it's, yeah. And this chapter is all about how different people read, which I think is just a really interesting to think about, and a really clever thing to be able to work into your own book. I just don't know, he's just a genius. What a guy.
What a guy. There's a bit of a theme developing in that I feel like I've talked about recently with Jemima about a book by Murakami, and with my sister about a book by Mario Vargas Llosa. And the thing I'm hearing again and again and again is sort of identity and sort of awareness of the reader, and like understanding who the reader is. I think it's really interesting that that has come through in these classics of translated fiction.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's something to do, I don't know where it comes from or why it's so common, but I just think it's very interesting.
Yeah. You know that little section you did just read, that was like a lot to take in. If you were to sort of like unpack that a little bit, what do you think it is sort of telling the reader?
I think really what it's saying is that you can read a sentence or you can read a book and it can feel so like the book can be enclosed in like cover to cover, that's a book, but really it's not. It's the plot, the characters, what the message of the book like extends beyond the two covers, and it kind of takes on a different meaning once it's in your own brain, and that meaning can be is different from reader to reader. Like two people can read a book and have a completely different analysis of it. They can take away different things, they can put different meanings onto it, and I think that's kind of what it's saying, if I was to attempt to unpack these words.
I think that is such an interesting point. I'm really glad you did unpack it, because that's really adds a whole nother level. Calvino, and definitely when I happened to read the Cosmo Comics shortly after reading Jorge Luis Borges's short stories fictiones, which are barely short stories. Like they are really more like philosophical papers. But I know that Calvino drew on him. They're really good. Like they're philosophical papers, but they're amazing. But Calvino drew on him quite a lot, and I feel like he is deeply, deeply philosophical, isn't it? It's really like these big questions that he's asking about the world in really beautiful, poetic ways. I was wondering if you had any sort of particular messages you liked, messages, philosophical viewpoint, messages from the beyond.
I'm not sure now that you've asked that.
A little bit of a convoluted way of saying, tell me something else. Tell me something else.
I feel like, kind of carrying on from what I just said, I feel like Calvino used writing fiction as opposed to writing like I mean, he did write some essays, I suppose, but I feel like he uses his works of fiction to convey various messages. Like his the first book that he wrote, the name of which I can only remember in Italian, The Path to the Spider's Nest, I think it's called. He is complete fiction, but he drew on his own experience as a member of the resistance in northern Italy. He used it to kind of send a message about how that was and sort of his feelings on the whole situation. Like they were occupied by the Germans. He used that work of complete fiction. Like none of the characters were real. They were based on some of the characters are based on people he encountered, but like I think very loosely. He uses that to give a message about war and the treatment of just the war, a nebulous concept. But I think it's interesting that he chose to say that through fiction as opposed to writing an essay about it or writing something else. Like he could have been anything essentially, and he chose to be a non-fiction writer, but still manages to get so much across through works of fiction.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, almost like that through this medium he can explore some ideas that he couldn't explore otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting.
I always find that fiction is sometimes an actually easier way to explore a really complex idea, that like an idea that's really convoluted, like you could never put
because there's the suspension of disbelief, isn't there? You can talk about something and you can be very hypothetical in the work of non-fiction. And no one's gonna call you out on it because it's not real. Whereas if you were using a real life situation to try and hypothesize on something, there would be people saying, oh well, that's not quite accurate, oh well, that didn't really happen. So I feel like you can go a lot further with fiction than you can with non-fiction a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your discussion of If On Always and the Night a Traveller?
Oh, I don't know. I would just say that despite it being a horrendous book at the start of the module that I did, and thinking I would never want to read this is horrible. Like, I gave Calvino a lot of credit for writing such a labyrinth of a text, but I just think it's a great book. I really do wish I could read it again with like almost a clean brain, so I could experience it for the first time.
Oh, don't we all wish that was like our favourite books? Like, there were certain books, if you could go back and just the joy of reading them and understanding and making a connection is
because there was a short story that I reread last week. I think Calvino wrote a selection of, they are very short stories, various different ones in a compilation called Difficult Loves, and there's a number of them. There's one called The Adventure of a Writer, The Adventure of a Skier. I think there's one called The Adventures of a Poet. And I first read The Adventures of a Reader at the start of this module. It was the first Calvino I'd ever read, before I read any of his novels, before I knew anything about him. And it's kind of like, it's not got a deeper meaning really. It's just something that he wrote, but it stuck with me, and I reread it last week, and even that it can't be very long, but it's mad how it can have such an effect. I would honestly say it's one of the nicest things I've ever read. The imagery that he creates, the things that he says, he's basically talking about this guy that goes and reads on a beach, and has like a really, really deep connection with all his books. But it's just so nice to read. It's one of those where you read it and your mind doesn't have to think. It's a really easy read, but at the same time it has you thinking, like, and it makes you aware of how you read books and how you connect to books. And so it'll kind of get your brain going, and then it'll stop that, and then it'll go back into the really nice imagery of this cove with the northern Italian sea, and it's just really nice.
That is the perfect recommendation to finish with. Thank you so much. That was just lovely conversation about a wonderful man. And if anyone hasn't read Calvino, we obviously can't recommend him enough.
Big recommendation.
Thanks, Amy. I really, really appreciate it.